Hello everyone, I welcome you to the CEC lecture series. I'm Nupur Chawla, teaching English literature at Maitri College, Delhi University. And today I'm here to commemorate along with all of you the World Poetry Day, which is on 21st of March. So this lecture, which is titled Reflections on Poetry, commemorating the World Poetry Day, is actually oriented towards discussing poetry in general, its different forms, its relevance to our day-to-day life, and why should we engage closely with this form of expression, right? In the previous lecture, we established, its connection or its importance to to our day-to-day living. Why should we read or write poetry? What are its essential elements? All these points we had discussed in the previous lecture. Now in this lecture, we will take our discussion forward and look at one of the important poetic genres at some length, which is the lyric. Now we had established that how broadly there are three poetic genres, that of the dramatic poetry, the epic poetry, and the lyric. And I also said that how lyric is one of the most popular forms of poetry, which a lot of you would have also come across, right? Now the features of a lyric, how is a lyric distinguished from other kinds of poems, is that it is usually a short poem, it has a single speaker, and in such a verse, the speaker reveals his or her thoughts, emotions, or processes of perception, right? So these are some of the central features of this form of expression. Now, if I take a look at an example of lyric, and of course, I mentioned that how William Wordsworth, the Romantic poet, is the first person that comes to mind the moment we talk about lyric, right? And how this particular genre of poetry actually flourished in the Romantic England as well, right? So before going into the sub-genres, if I can call it that, of lyric, let's very quickly take a look at this lyric by William Wordsworth. So we are just going to look at this one stanza from this very popular lyric called Daffodils, which was written by Wordsworth in 1802. And I quote, "I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high over vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze." Unquote. So very clearly, the foremost thing that we notice is the I. The speaker is discussing or is expressing his impressions of a moment when he was wandering alone one day. He had gone out on a solitary walk, and that's when he spotted daffodils, right? So now the beauty of daffodils, just that moment of observing daffodils while on a walk alone, becomes the subject of this poem. Now you see, if you look at the language or the way Wordsworth has described this moment, he says, "I wandered lonely as a cloud." Now very clearly he is using the figure of speech simile. He is imagining himself as a cloud. Cloud, why? According to Wordsworth, a cloud is lonely. It does not have friends, or it is not very really seen in clusters. So we see that sometimes a cloud is evident in the sky as this one entity. So that's what Wordsworth is imagining. He says that I wandered lonely as a cloud. So just like a cloud would be seen wandering in the sky, he imagines himself as a cloud. He says that floats on high over vales and hills. Vales over here refers to valleys. When all at once I saw a crowd. And so while he was alone, all of a sudden he saw a crowd. Now you see, Now again, look at the word crowd. Now the moment we hear the word crowd, it seems that perhaps he would be talking about people, but no. The immediate next sentence says, a host of golden daffodils. Now, so this crowd was a crowd of daffodils. Now you see, again, what do we notice? A non-literal usage of the word. So in the previous lecture, remember we had talked about that how that this is the third important element of a poetry or of a poem, where it uses words in a non-literal form. So over here, crowd does not refer to a group of people, but here he uses the word crowd to refer to a bunch or a huge number of golden daffodils beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. Now, fluttering and dancing in the breeze, we see immediately when we read these words, we are able to picture these flowers moving breezily, in while a cool wind blows, right? So what is the poet doing? Instead of telling, instead of describing, the poet is actually evoking these images, right? And this again becomes an important part of all poetry, and also over here that of a lyric. So this then is an example or a very short excerpt from Daffodils. I'm sure that after having looked at these initial lines, you must be tempted to read the whole poem. So please go ahead. It's a small one, but one that will definitely stay with you for a long time. Now coming to the forms of the lyric, as I said that this short poem has further different sub forms. We will look at a few of them today. Now the first form is a sonnet. Now what is a sonnet? A sonnet comprises a single stanza of 14 lines which are joined by a specific rhyme scheme. Okay. Now this form of lyric, which is a sonnet, it does not have different stanzas, right? So if you read other lyrics, you will see multiple stanzas which are part of the poem. But a sonnet will just comprise one stanza of 14 lines. Now of course, there are certain other variations to the sonnet form where a sonnet is followed by a couplet, in some cases. Now those are some of the experiments that were done by the different poets, but essentially that's what it comprises of, right? Now it also has a rhyme scheme which is very specific. Now the sonnet form, if we see that when did it come into being, it actually started off in the 13th century in Europe. There's a poet, Italian Renaissance poet Petrarch. Under this poet, this form actually became, or one can say it actually came into its own, and from there it was adapted by the English poets as well, right? So starting in the 13th century, going on till 14th, 15th, and the 16th century, sonnet, has been that, kind of lyric which has stood the test of time, and it has been utilized, or it has been used for expression by different poets. Now, of course, even Shakespeare has written sonnets, and some of them are, in fact, were quite oft quoted as well. But when we talk about one of the early, poets, early English poets to have used the form, Sir Philip Sidney comes to mind. Okay, now he was a poet who was there from 1554 to 1586. So in the 16th century, which was the peak of Renaissance in England. And there's a very popular sonnet sequence by Philip Sidney, which is called Astrophel and Stella, right? And let's look at the first sonnet that he wrote, and I'll present to you, an excerpt from that, just to give you a flavor of what a sonnet sounds like. I quote, "Loving in truth and fain in verse my love to show, that she, dear she, might take some pleasure of my pain. Pleasure might cause her read, reading might make her know. Knowledge might pity win, and pity grace obtain. I sought fit words to paint the blackest face of woe." Unquote. Now you see, this is a sonnet which talks about love. Now sonnets often comprised experiences of a lover who is seeking favors of a beloved, and they capture the experience of the lover who's trying his best to get favors of his beloved. So in this sonnet, he says that loving in truth and fain in verse, my love to show. He says that this verse will show my love, right? That she dear, she might take some pleasure of my pain. He says that when I express my love in truth, and also in this verse that I am writing, in this sonnet that I am writing, so that when she reads it, she might get a sense of the pain that I am going through because of my love for her, and because of the weight that I've had to endure in order to have some kind of a proximity to the beloved. So he says the pleasure might cause her read, reading might make her know. So know what? He says that when I express my love in this sonnet, and when my beloved reads it, that might become a means for her to know how much I love her, right? Knowledge might pity win, and pity grace obtain. So he says that once she becomes aware of the fact that how much I'm in love with her, that might make her pity me. That might make her pity my condition, that how I've been trying so hard to get her favors, to win her favors, to get her attention. And when she reads this poem, I hope that she is able to acknowledge this love of mine and reciprocate and respond to these advances. And he says, I sought fit words to paint the blackest face of woe. Now, what is woe? Woe is sadness, right? Now, what is the sadness over here about? It's the sadness of a lover who has been trying his best to get favors from his lady. So we see that how this sonnet has a rhyme scheme very clearly, and we also notice that very obviously the poet, or in fact the speaker over here expresses his deeply felt emotion. He is expressing his love for the lady in this verse, and in fact he expects that perhaps this verse then might become a means for the woman to acknowledge his love. So again, a lyric which carries the intensity of emotion of the speaker, right? So this is the sonnet for us. The next form of lyric is ode. Now you would have come across the word ode a lot of times, and this is a particular kind of a poem that again was or this form was used by different poets such as P.B. Shelley, John Keats, and of course various others as well. Now what exactly is an ode? It's a long lyric. Okay, it's a long lyric poem which is serious in subject and treatment. It is elevated in style, and there's a purpose. There are particular occasions in which ode is written. It is written to eulogize or praise an individual or an object, right? So for instance, there's a very popular ode called Ode to Grecian Urn. So over there, the poet is, has written this long lyric in order to praise the urn. What is an urn? It's a kind of a pot, right? So likewise, there are odes written to people as well. Okay, and of course, how is it different from a sonnet? That it is definitely long. The subject is serious, and it's also expressed in an elevated style. When I say elevated style, it means that the language is not a simple language of day-to-day parlance, just as we might to an extent find in Wordsworth. We just now noticed when we looked at the extract from Daffodils. But an ode would then have a more stylized language in that sense. So one of the most oft quoted odes by P.B. Shelley is called Ode to the West Wind. Right, now let's very quickly take a look at an excerpt from this ode and see what are the features that we have identified there. And I quote, "O wild west wind, thou breath of autumn's being, thou from whose unseen presence the leaves dead are driven like ghosts from an enchanter fleeing, yellow and black and pale and hectic red, pestilence-stricken multitudes, thou who chariotest to their dark wintry bed." Unquote. Now, the first thing that we had said was that ode is always in praise of someone or something. Now, very clearly, the poem begins with what? O wild west wind. So, very clearly, we see that the poet is directly referring to the west wind. And this poem is written in praise of the west wind. And you will see that the entire poem is, comprises of words of appreciation of how powerful the west wind is, what are its, different, ways of operation, etc. It says, now over here, Shelley says that, "O wild west wind, thou breath of autumn's being." So now the west wind actually, blows in the season of autumn. And he says that you from whose unseen presence. Now again, look at the word unseen presence. When we look at this phrase, we again identify that how the poet has used this, a particular device, which is called, where the two opposite words come together, right? Presence is supposed to, be a material presence, but unseen presence. When somebody is present, then of course you see them. But he refers to the west wind and calls it the unseen presence, right? Because you cannot see the wind, but you can definitely feel its presence, and therefore he calls it its unseen presence. The leaves dead are driven like ghosts, right? Now again, using a simile here, he says that with the presence of the wind in the autumn season, leaves are driven, they are swept away like ghosts that are running away from an enchanter, right? Again, what do we see? An imaginative flight. Comparing the wind or comparing the leaves to a ghost that are running away from the enchanter who's trying to capture the ghosts, right? So we see that this ode by P.B. Shelley is in appreciation of the west wind. Now, yellow and black and pale and hectic red, pestilence-stricken multitudes. Now, pestilence-stricken multitudes, over here we see that how the poet uses these multiple words, almost like a cascading reference to the leaves in the autumn season. Of course, in spring we see that how leaves and flowers look at are their beautiful best, but during autumn they kind of start to turn pale, they start to turn yellow, they change color, they become weak because it's time for those leaves to shed from the tree and new ones to appear. And therefore, the poet imagines leaves during autumn as pestilence stricken. Pestilence stricken means that they seem to be diseased because they've turned pale, right? So look at the imaginative flight of a poet over here, and that's what makes it a very, very interesting read as well, right? So this then is a second subgenre of lyric, that is the ode, which is written in praise of an individual or an object. Now, a third sub-form of a lyric is a dramatic monologue, right? Now, it was actually perfected by the poet Robert Browning. The moment we talk of dramatic monologue, it is not possible that Robert Browning's name doesn't appear, because he is foremost associated with this kind of lyric. Now, it again, dramatic monologue involves a single person whose words make up the poem, all right, in a specific situation. So the speaker or the individual is in a particular situation, is he or she is thinking about something, and the words uttered by that individual in that moment then form this poem. And very clearly we will notice that how this poem then reveals the speaker's temperament and character. Okay. Now, one of the very popular instances or examples of a dramatic monologue is Robert Browning's poem My Last Duchess, which was written in 1842. Now, as the title itself suggests, My Last Duchess, here a duke is showing the painting of his former duchess or his former wife. Now, let's look at a few lines from this poem. Now, that's how it begins. That is my last duchess, painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. I call that piece a wonder now. Fra Pandolf's hands worked busily a day, and there she stands. Will it please you to sit and look at her? Unquote. Now, these are the opening lines of Robert Browning's My Last Duchess. Now, very clearly, this speaker is introducing the painting of his wife, and he says that looking as if she were alive. So he is very in detail describing this painting. He says that look how beautiful this painting is. In fact, it seems to be such that as if she's alive, that it's not a painting, right? As if she is sitting right in front of us. So here he's actually, showing his painting to a guest that has come over. And we see then how this poem then carries the thoughts of the speaker about his late wife. Now, a fourth form of the lyric is the elegy. Now, in an elegy, we see the subject of the poem is change or loss, which is expressed in the verse form. So, if ode was written in praise, elegy is written when there is a sense of loss or when the poet wants to talk about a sense of change. Now, Alfred Lord Tennyson, has written this oft-quoted elegy, which is called In Memoriam, which was written in 1850. Now, of course, elegies have been written by different poets, capturing a sense of loss and a particular kind of loss. But here, Tennyson wrote this poem when he lost his very good friend, right? So these we see that are the sub forms of the lyric: the ode, the sonnet, the elegy, etc. Now, of course, there are further other subtypes as well, but you see that how diverse is this poetic form. There are such variations, so many variations available. While the basic remains the same, the basic understanding of the poetic form is there. Of course, while the modern poets experimented a lot with the poetic conventions, but of course we have also understood what are the defining features of poems, right? So we see that how then lyric has these different forms. Lastly, we will mention very quickly about poetry and purpose. We see that how poetry then always has, I would say, in a lot of time, in a lot of cases, has a purpose. Now that's why Percy Bysshe, Shelley, P.B. Shelley, said that poets and philosophers are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. So you see how he is equating poets with philosophers and how they legislate the world. So which means what? That how poetry is not only to give us a sense of relief, it's not only to give us a sense of beauty, capture a sense of beauty or emotion, but poetry has purpose as well. In fact, there is this particular kind of poetry, which is the poetry of commitment, which carries ideas and which makes it a point to articulate a perspective that otherwise may not be available to people, right? Now, we also notice that because of the fact that a lot of poetry is associated with purpose, poets also face some kind of pressure from society. They are constantly, under vigilance. What they say, when they say, is always a matter of interest by the powers that be. So we see that how a poet then, while he or she engages with the lyrical or with the aesthetic or the rhythmic qualities of language, but at the same time, there are also these very real challenges that he faces in the actual life when he is particularly using the poetic mode for a purpose and to bring about change. So poetry then, while it adds a sense of musicality, adds an idea of beauty, but at the same time it also has purpose. It also a big chunk of poetry has purpose, and it carries ideas that we need to reckon with. So on this day, I hope that we've been able to understand the significance of poetry, and we feel inspired enough to read some poetry and also write some verses of our own. Thank you.